Hello YouTube, welcome back to the bench. As you may have guessed, today we're working on a Ruger. This is the famous or infamous, depending on your opinion of it, Ruger Mark III 1022. The 1022 series is one of the most popular target pistols in, well, forever. And it's also notoriously difficult for people to get back together if they manage to take it apart. And partially because of the way the instruction manual is written. It's almost a guide in calisthenics in terms of hold it sideways, point it up, pull the trigger, point it down, shake it left and right, all this stuff, all of which is meant to help you orient the parts, but rather than just tell you exactly what you're doing, they kind of give you a how-to instead, and it really gets people lost. So we'll go into all that today. You do need a magazine to take this firearm apart. It has a magazine safety, and since there are points in the assembly and disassembly where you have to discharge the trigger without the magazine in place, the safety is not tripped and you can't actually do that. So, as always, safety first. Nothing in the chamber, no magazine in, and the magazine we're working with today is in fact empty. Just realizing I have my wrong glasses on, can't actually see what I'm doing. Okay. So, yeah, the field strip is essentially getting the bolt out, and we'll use that as our start point, field stripping it, putting it back together before we go all the way down in. So, as I mentioned, one of the things we're going to have to do is pull the trigger, and to accomplish that, pulling the trigger without the magazine in doesn't do anything. With the magazine in and seated, you can hear the hammer drop, and so that's kind of important. So now the hammer's cocked, magazine is in, and we're going to pull that trigger so that we have released the hammer. From there, we're going to look at this back of it, and you've got this combination piece here. It's the main spring, it's also the takedown lever, and it's also this big pin that holds the slide onto the frame. And to get it moving, you start by just popping the little middle leg out. Now the first thing you're going to notice is you can't do that with the magazine still in it. So again, pop the middle leg out. Now this guy's going to rotate out of the body of the magazine, and we can see, or excuse me, out of the body of the frame. This tail piece here, that's what actually locks it in. So when we have that piece collapsed, that tail sticks out significantly further, and it will actually be below where the whole piece slides in. So that's what's holding it in the frame when it's down. So that's essentially your takedown lever there. Once it rotates out, you're going to find it stops right about there. Now if you want to keep your firearm in relatively nice condition, you don't want to mess this part up. You don't want to push up on it really hard to try and lever it down, but it is prone to pinching your fingers in almost any condition. But what you want to do is grab onto it, and you're trying to pull this pin down. So you got to keep in mind, how that's all oriented. That pin is going straight up and down and into another piece that you really can't see and can't get a particularly good grip on. So you just want to grab, and as you're guiding it out, you just want to go straight down. And if you're lucky, you'll come right down into the body of the frame and not scratch it up too bad. Eventually you're going to tear up the sides of the back. It's just kind of inevitable. So as we could see in there, this pin goes through the slide and frame, holds it all together, and when it's all the way in the gun, That's your orientation. One of the things that's going to make putting it together hard is this particular area right here. If you get the hammer strut stuck in there when you go to close it up, you're just going to have a bad day. There's nowhere for it to go. That's not where it's supposed to go. As I mentioned, this is also the main spring of the gun. So the same spring that down here is putting tension on the takedown lever goes all the way up through the body and has this cup on this end, which is actually where the hammer strut goes in to get all the tension for firing. So a multi-function piece. At this point, if we've done it right, well, that's a big if apparently. Actually, it's not. What it's telling us is that it wants us to put the magazine in, pull the trigger. What? Oh. As I was mentioning, getting the mainspring in the right position is part of the challenge here. And so what's happened to me is, by not paying attention, I've gotten my mainspring, get my little flashlight assistance, stuck onto the frame itself, which is dumb. I don't know why Ruger doesn't manufacture this mainspring to be just, you know, 1/8 of an inch longer. Just long enough so that this doesn't actually happen. So, with it in the right position, you will be able to see the mainspring just barely making appearance here, off to the side, and freely able to move around. So once that's out of your way, then the bolt comes out. We'll go into stripping the bolt down. At this point, the slide and frame are held together only by friction on a piece up front, but it's kind of a lot of friction. It's a metal piece wedging itself under the polymer frame. So depending on how strong your thumbs are, you may be able to pop it off. You might not. So I'm going to use the assistance of the rubber mallet, wherever I have put it. Oh, come on. Not the rubber mallet. There it is. And tap that to help get it off. So what we were tapping against there. Now, for disassembly, the slide is going forward and the frame is going backwards. For reassembly, it's the other way around. And the parts that we're putting together here, this cut in the body of the slide, this little square hole lines up with this lug right here, and it's actually a little piece of metal embedded in the plastic frame. Or is it actually just really hard polymer? Who the hell knows? I lied, it's just hard polymer. Anyway, the point is, everything else is just sitting in there, and none of it is actually making contact, because these are all the moving parts. And so it's literally held together just by this piece right here until you drive the back end in and add that pin to it. So this is your basic field strip. This is as far as you need to take it down for basic cleaning. We're going to go ahead into the belly of the beast eventually. For now, we're going to just show your basic cleaning procedures and walk through that. Now, Ruger has done something possibly unique to this firearm or firearms in general. I've never seen it in anything else that I can think of. But the Mark III has a loaded chamber indicator, which when there's a round in the chamber, it sticks out to the side, has the word loaded on it in tiny little letters and a little red light up flag. Also visible from the bottom for reasons I don't even want to know. But what's going in there is you've got this blind pin. So when you're looking at it, you're like, well, I could figure out how to get one of those in, but what? There's no other side. These screws up here, that's to mount optics on it. And so what do you do? And there's a couple different answers. One is the the momentum trick, where if you whack it on something really hard, technically that pin is going to keep going a little bit and start to work itself out. The goopier it is, the harder that's going to be to get to work right. So the other way is with a magnet. If you've got a magnet and you have a little bit of luck and it's not too gunky, the magnet will also help draw it out. Now in this case, I think mine's just a little on the new side, so the magnet's not behaving well enough. So we're just going to use the old-fashioned whack on it till it comes out. Now again, what you're doing is you're just imparting a whole lot of momentum to the slide and obviously the pin at the same time, and then bringing the slide to an abrupt stop somewhere that's not going to also stop the pin. So the recessed areas on this block leave room for the pin to keep coming forward, and it will start to walk its way out. And once it's walked its way out just a tiny little bit, we should be able to get a hold of it with some pliers and pop it the rest of the way out. And if we're really clever, we'll also launch the other piece halfway across the armory. And we did. So that's the piece, and of course the infinitesimally small screw managed to find its way all the way to the carpet. Alright, so little luck, got some recovery, we're good. No fear. So if you were smart enough to put a thumb over yours before you popped it out and let it go shooting across the floor, across the room, what you will have extracted from the firearm is essentially this orientation. So again, when something... Wow, I'm still missing a piece of this. It's just not my day. I think we're going to start this video over. Well, maybe not. Good gravy. Great googly moogly. Let's get everybody back together, and then we can talk about how and why this guy works. So there's a couple different things going on here. Two different springs. There's the one large spring that's actually going to keep it in the I am not loaded position, and the whole thing pivots around this this piece of metal that's lying in the plastic. So there's a metal insert that goes with a tiny little tail end under the little darker colored spring, which usually, if you're lucky, stays in the body. And when that pushes in, it's got room to move in there. And so this is going to be pushing out while the regular tensioning spring is pushing it back in. So the metal part's what the round actually pushes on, the metal part of a cartridge, to let you know that it's loaded. But the point of this is that these parts really aren't held in by a whole heck of a lot, except for the fact that they're in a small slot and can't go real far. So hang on to them. There's going to be two springs, one that just sits on a very tiny post, and then an even smaller one that sits in the plastic insert. And when you get this and you want to put it together, this very pointy end of the metal insert does have to get under that tiny spring just ever so slightly. And just putting the whole thing in the gun aligns them all. I mention this because this part does get super funky as you use it, and so it is a good idea to get it out of there when you're cleaning. The unfortunate reality of this is that it's a big heavy barrel, and it's really made to not come out of the rest of it. They do have light models where the barrel is actually a shrouded piece that unscrews, but the target, the match or bull barrel ones, the whole point of them is to have a whole lot of steel up top so that there's virtually no recoil. And if that's what makes it a target pistol, is you can pop round after round of this guy off and never going to move, just going to sit there waiting for you to pull the trigger again right on target. And the tragedy here is that there's no, I don't know, maybe if you've got super small fingers you can get in here, but it makes it pretty difficult. So Brownell sells some shop swabs, which is, they look like a cotton ball on the end of a metal 3-inch small metal stick. And the cotton ball is actually a big polyester ball, and you use that for cleaning. You can use it with some solvent, and it fits in there relatively nicely and lets you get in there, get everything wiped down. The other thing with these is to try not to let stuff accumulate. That's what really makes this hard. Is as stuff builds up, it's harder and harder to get at. It's another one where if you've got a small hobby knife, that can make it easier to get in there and clean, because you can kind of scrape around the edges where stuff builds up. And you also want to get in there with a pipe cleaner, because there's no other way to get at the holes for where on this side the loaded chamber indicator sits, and over here, this recess here, that's where your extractor has to slide in. So if it's full of schmutz, then you're going nowhere. This is the ejector system, and it is riveted in place. So be gentle with it. If this starts to wobble around on you, then you're looking at a pretty pain in the butt repair, because you got to get a machine that can rivet in there again, and it's not real easy to do with a hammer. So make sure that the extractor isn't moving around. That's just general checkup on it, and then get everything out of there that you can. Q-tips, you're going to go through a lot of Q-tips. And that's it for the main body there. For the bolt system, this is another one where it doesn't require tooling in general to take it apart. It's held in by just nowhere for the parts to go once they're in there. So you start, and you want to lift out the firing pin spring, and so this is captivated, and on one end it's got this little crescent piece, and on the other end it's got the little, I don't know, looks kind of like a very odd spaceship situation. But this end is fixed, and it's designed to simply line up there, and when you're cocking the gun, remember that this big piece is coming up through here, and the big piece isn't going to move, but the bolt is. The bolt's going to go backwards, and if this has got nowhere to go on the forward side, what's going to happen here is the spring's going to compress. So the front is just holding the sides of the crescent there in place, and that big bolt pin is going to come up, and and that's actually how it cocks. It puts all that spring pressure under there, and then that's your recoil rod system. So that makes it go catch all that force, and then let it all out back into the bolt going forward. So anyway, recoil rod. I think I referred to this as the firing pin spring earlier. I apologize if I did. This is simply the recoil spring and recoil spring assembly. Further in, the firing pin itself, it does have a spring underneath it that you can't quite see yet, and there's a pin that goes through the body of it, and that pin is usually not under, it's usually not peened in place or anything special. So just, keeping a finger on it so you're not going to lose the firing pin when it's not under tension. Just, glide that pin out. Shouldn't be difficult. And the firing pin should just lift right up and out. And then underneath it, you're going to see its spring, which we can then tip out. So the spring sits on this little alignment piece. It has a little bit of an angle bend to it, and then the tail that the spring can actually sit on. So the spring sits on it like that, and then this little hook or angled piece that that angles down into a recess down in. See if we can throw some extra light on it. Down inside here, if you see that recess going at the end of the firing pin channel. So what we're talking about is that recess there where I just put the punch. And that's what we're talking about. That's where that piece goes. So when you're putting it back together, that's how you line it up. Is you get it in there and you just lay it inside. And what you'll notice is the firing pin has just this tiny, ever so slight hook on the bottom, and that's designed to get under that piece. Now, if the piece is all the way in there and you try and hook it, you're probably going to miss. It rarely comes up completely high enough for you to just catch it like that. You might do it if you're really lucky, but realistically, what most of us are going to be doing is putting the firing pin front side, aligning it with that groove, and then really tipping it over backwards. And there you can see that when you've tipped it, you can catch the spring on that little hook. And now when you go to put it back together, you've caught the spring, and if you keep it lined up straight, now the whole thing goes in there, and you're in the right spot, and you've got spring tension. So when you go to slide pin back in, hold it all in place, you've actually got the spring tension. Now if you missed and you're on top of it, it's not going to spring back, and it's probably not going to be able to get that pin in without mushing things. So again, just be cognizant of that stuff. Hang on to all your little bits. So in case it wasn't obvious, since the firing pin is sitting in there, the hammer is going to be coming up through the body and hitting the firing pin thusly. Let me get into how that works. The last pieces in here are the extractor claw, and then there's an extractor claw plunger behind it, and then a spring that you can't really get to in the body of it. And for this, it's kind of hard to get in here. If you push the extractor back, there is one area that's a little bit wider to help you get something in there, but it's still pretty tricky to get a piece in there. I find I often go in there with a hobby knife to get it started, and get some pressure back there behind it. Once you get something in between the extractor and the plunger that's pushing on it, then you want to pull it back far enough to get it out. So I'm going to find my smaller punch and give this the old college try. So one of the tricks is to simply put enough pressure on it that you can wedge something in there. So when you pull it back, I can just use the punch to apply pressure with the idea of getting something in that space. So now I've got the tip of the knife in there holding that piece back, and if I can get all of my parts in there at the same time, I can get the punch now between the plunger and the actual extractor, which should give me enough room to pull to miss and let the whole thing reset. So the idea is that we want to get the punch in there, pull the plunger all the way back, and then lift the extractor out. So give it one more try. Really, it's easy. Anybody can do it. Seriously, once you get the hang of this, it's not nearly as bad as all that. He said after failing a third time. I suspect Ruger makes a tool that makes this easier, or there's a trick to it that nobody ever liked me enough to show me, all of which seem likely. Of course, the more oil that's on this, the harder keeping it still with friction is, so I am working against myself a little bit by the simple fact that I kept it clean. Really, Sturm? If nothing else, it's a lesson in perseverance. Try and get some of the oil off of it. Maybe I can get a little bit better grip. Alright, lift it up, hold it back. Alright. So I've gotten it part of the way out now, so it's going to hopefully hold itself together long enough to get it the rest of the way out. And I feel like I'm making progress, if nothing else. Alright, so now that we can get this out, we can show you why it's so much of a battle. The plunger is not just a round plunger pushing, if it were nice it would just have been like that, so once you get it past you're good to go. But what it actually is it's a half plunger because they're short on space in here. And so disassembly means that you've got to get it not only this far back, but it has to rotate out, which means you've got to get it even farther. So it has to have lots of clearance. And at that point, there's no way to grab onto it. So really, you're just trying to get lucky and shake it out in the right direction until it's just far enough past that then the plunger shoots forward and sends it flying across the room. So, again, not a piece you always have to take out. You can often get this clean well enough on its own. Obviously I don't clean mine every time or I wouldn't be able to get the dirt off it that I'm getting off now. And I'm just gonna clean it up since it's out. Everybody loves to have clean parts. And now you can get in here. Again, pipe cleaners, pretty much a necessity. There's really no way to get at anything else in here without them. All the way into all the blind holes. That is another point. On some of these, they do make that larger hole go all the way through the body and out the other side, so you can actually use a punch to assist yourself in getting that out. In this case, it does go halfway. That recess cut we were talking about, where the firing pin plunger sits, that is actually accessible. So I've never tried it, but in theory, if you worked a paper clip around from the backside, maybe you could help push that out. Who knows? Either way, getting it back together is generally far easier. And we're going to go ahead and reassemble the slide as we go here, and then get into the whole total takedown. Actually, we're going to leave these apart in case we want to use them as a reference when we're going through the frame. as far as this goes, essentially no user serviceable parts inside. If you take this apart, I don't think you're going to get it back together. The pins that are holding it together are all pushed in and heavily peened in. I think that they're just press fitted under a god-awful amount of pressure. This is actually a locking mechanism. Not all of them have them, but some do. If they do, essentially it prevents the hammer strut from being movable. That's it. So let's set all of our slide parts aside. And our bolt. And let's get into the frame. So, pardon me. The frame. When you're looking at it, you're going to see lots of pins, and don't hammer on any of them trying to get this apart. You will have a really bad day. Everything in this gun is holding something else in. It's very much an additive mechanism where as you are building up from the bottom, you are connecting each part holding in the part after it. And all of the pins have springs that go through grooves in them. So if you just hit one of the pins really hard, you'll just be destroying a spring. So we're kind of going to work from the hammer system down and forward, but that means that the hammer pin itself is the first pin we're going to take out, but again, it's not going to move real far on its own. And what's holding it back, I hope the heck there's enough light for you to see this, is this spring right here, this little tiny guy. It's kind of eyelash width wire. If you can see it moving back and forth there, that is what's going on. It's leaning in a groove on the hammer pin. So long as it's leaning in its groove, our hammer pin is going nowhere. So you've got to get in there with something small, pointy, a small screwdriver. Where's my small screwdriver? A small flat blade will get in there. Anything. You don't want to scratch stuff up real bad, but you just really want to move that guy a tiny bit. Doesn't have to go real far to get out of the way. And then we're going to start that pin out. And as we start to get that pin out, all the guts are going to come spilling out horribly in all directions on us. So I'm going to pull it halfway out so you can see the groove that tiny little spring is sitting in. And then we're just going to pop it out and get the guts out. Blah. So also remember which pin goes where. On some of the models, they weren't as friendly. This one has a nice wide end that accomplishes two things. One, it can't go all the way through the frame, which means it sticks out and is a slightly different size than the other pin. And also differentiates it from the front pin. So as long as you're paying attention to which pins go in where, they really, each pin has a particular hole. So while they may share diameters with other holes, if you remember the shape of the pin and which ones have a head and which ones don't, it'll be a lot easier on yourself getting it back together. So what I've done here is just to raise the trigger bar so you can see all the parts at once. And we're going to go slowly through this as we take them off and kind of go into what each one is doing and why it has the crazy shape that it has. This is your hammer. So out of it, it's a strange shape, and since it's not an exposed hammer, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. All that matters is that it's got a hammer strut and it's off center from the pivot point, and down here on the underside, it's got a sear surface, so something can sit in here and hold the hammer back, and then when something else applies a great deal of force to the hammer strut, pushing it upwards, and the sear moves out of the way, it's going to be able to rotate and come forward and hit our firing pin. So if we think about what we said earlier, the hammer is actually going to be sitting right below this and come forward and smack straight up and down at that point. That's where it comes and hits the firing pin. So bang, bang, bang. I shined this one up just for the fun of it. It does not actually have a whole lot of functional difference in why this surface is shiny. I was really just trying to make it look prettier because mine had a really horrible rough finish. Does not actually touch anything on these surfaces, so the fact that they're shiny has no effect on the functionality of the firearm. That's about it for the hammer. Alright, so the hammer does not ride directly on the hammer pin. It actually has a sleeve down here, and so the next part we're going to take off is actually 3 parts at once. I'm going to hold them together so you can see that the trigger bar has a square hole, and in that square hole rides the other end of this cylinder. So it's got room to the trigger bar can actually move around this, and has some space to do that in. We'll get into why it does that. This cylinder has a small ring at one end, that would be the right side of it, to keep the other parts from falling off. And the other parts that we're talking about here are in fact the magazine safety mechanism. So this spring is going to be putting pressure to pull this this crazy shaped spring. Has one hooked end here, and it's got a recess on the magazine safety. Has this little half moon recess. That's where the spring clips onto it. A lot of people get confused and try and get the spring to line up with that notch. That notch is actually what grabs the sear. So when there's no magazine in the firearm, this is pulled downward by the spring, and this notch actually just goes over the sear and holds it there. The sear can't go anywhere. It's completely contained in that notch. When the magazine is inserted into the firearm, then this piece is rotated upward and releases the sear to be free to move around. So the spring has some crazy shapes because it really is just trying to fit around all the other parts that are in there and find its way onto the back of the frame where there's a flat area for it to lie against, and do its thing. And then the cylinder so that all this stuff can rotate around it. Now another piece fell out on us while we were sitting here because there's nothing else holding it in at this point, and that's the safety. Now you might notice a similarity in the notch there and the notch there, because they're in the exact same place and they have the exact same functionality. Just like the magazine safety hangs onto the sear, the safety hangs onto the sear. So when it's in the fire position, this is up. When you push it up into the safe position, you're rotating that down, and when we get into where the sear is, you're going to see that the sear would be lodged in that crack and not go anywhere. There is a detent system in here. Now it looks like a ball, but it's not. It's a ball on a stick, and if you tap it a little or grab some handy dandy pliers and guide it out, you can eventually get it to come out. So I'm going to tap here. There we go. It's important to remember which is which. You've got another lever up here that's going to have a nearly identical system of a spring on a stick. So that's just a little pin with a ball end and a spring that it sits on and a hole drilled into the piece. And it uses the shape of the frame itself. This bump shape here is what that rides in. So the little springy part has a little more room on either of these, so that gives you a solid thump, 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 thump up and down as you thumb the safety on and off. However, this is under a significantly different amount of tension than this one. This is our slide lock. It needs to move up and down fairly easily because, again, there's a last round lockback feature, and not a whole lot else pushing that in the direction that you want it to go. So it's a very light spring, whereas this one is more solid because you don't want it to accidentally come off safe. So if you get them confused, it's you want to find the stiffer one and make sure that's in the back. I try and keep them with the piece, the spring, on the ball and stick at all times if I can, and that way I don't lose track of it. Now, some other stuff is going on here. We've got our trigger bar flopping around, and while we're not going to take the trigger out right now, we are going to... Actually, let's go ahead and take the trigger out now. We have an option. We can either go after the sear system or we can go after the trigger system. Both of them are available. The trigger return force is this plunger and big spring under it here. So if we tip the gun over, that comes out, and so it just goes into the trigger itself. There's a big hole in the back of the trigger, and this piece sits in there, and as soon as we start trying to do anything with the trigger, it's going to fall out. So it's best if we drop it out deliberately when we're ready to. So the other thing you can do when you're working on this is to try and keep the subsystems separate. So we know that all of that was going around on the hammer pin. We're going to make another pile over here for the stuff going on in Triggerland. Now there is a pin here, and just like with the last pin, there's something holding it in there. And in this case, it is a multi-purpose spring that's also holding, of all things, the magazine release in. So there is a wire that goes, and you can see the end of it because there's a hole in the frame where it actually hooks in. It's providing the tension that keeps the magazine release in the gun. It comes up here, wraps around stuff in the frame. There's a guide path in the frame, and then comes under here with a little bit of upward force to provide tension on that pin in another groove on the pin. So in order to get it out, what they've done is, as it comes under here, it hooks straight up at 90 degrees a little bit past the pin. And the point of that is that if you can see it in there, poof, I'm not sure if you can, but basically straight down from where this punch is the end of that spring that's sticking up at that 90 degrees. Which means that if I do this and put a little bit of tension on that pin, and at the same time I come in there and push the springy bit down, I can get that started. So once it's started, it comes right out, and again, you can see the mechanism. In this case, the pin has a significant groove because it's a fairly thick spring that was holding it in there. Now this one, for reasons I don't recall, also has this other small groove on the very end of it, which is a little worrisome because it makes me think I've swapped the pins, but no, in fact, I think it's just decorative more than anything. So, whoops, the trigger part's over here. So now the trigger can slide out and fall right off. No, just kidding. So if we want to see how this all looks in the gun, the spring here sitting in the body of the trigger. It's kind of neat to have it built in like this. It's an interesting lever. That's going to be pushing the trigger bar up as a general rule. So when all else is equal, the trigger bar will have a lifting force there. But similarly, it's pushing the trigger back forward. So in the gun, this whole thing is generally compressed a little bit. You're going to pull the trigger back so it goes bang. The trigger can disconnect going up and down, and when their fingers off the trigger, it'll come back forward. So it's doing all that stuff at once, which is nice. Whenever they can get one spring to do the trigger return function, the disconnect function all at once, I think it tends to make a nicer feel of the whole system, as well as a little bit more reliability, fewer parts. It does, this little leg on the trigger bar is there, solely to push down on the spring, and they made this nice, so it's got a thin pin that goes through the top of the trigger there, but it's got also a little bit of a fat rounded base to give it a nice solid engagement there, so there's no wiggle between these. You don't get any left and right motion. Let's see. I forgot why this has an adjustment in it. Well, that's mind-blowing. Is that over? It has a hex adjustment here, and for the life of me, I can't remember what the point of that is. It doesn't actually come out anywhere, so it's a blind hole with a hex screw in it. So what I'm thinking is that if you unscrewed that so that it actually was coming out the front of the trigger, then intellectually, do a little intellectual gymnastics here, what would that actually accomplish for us? So if there was something sticking out right here, it would control how far the trigger could come forward before it bottomed out. The more you pushed that in there, it's an over travel screw. There you go. So yeah, the trigger, as you pull the trigger back, that hole is on the far side of it, so anything in there needs to go forward. So if you wanted to time the over travel, you would loosen that screw out a little bit at a time, and at some point, as soon as the sear released, you would want that to bottom out very soon after that, so that you didn't have any over travel at all. Mine's just not adjusted. So I have seen them with a different mechanism for that, where people have just drilled a hole through the body of it. But there you go, learn something new every day. Now that we're in here, the slide release can come out, and it's a little bit odd design. Just make sure you don't lose the detent as you take it out. It can't go in or out while the rest of the trigger system is there, and it does slide into the frame a little bit, so getting it out is a little bit strange. You kind of have to tilt it down and out at an angle, and then it can come out. And likewise, getting it back in, you want to dip it down in there and get that back piece started, and once you get it started like that, it'll then be, whoops, it'll then fall completely apart. So what you're trying to do all at once is get some pressure on that detent ball. Now, I don't know if you remember the one that we took out of the other piece, but it had a heavier metal gauge spring wire on it, and the balls are nearly identical in size. I've seen some models where the ball was slightly smaller on one as well to help keep track of them, but in this case, not so much. So one of the things that you're doing when you're putting it together is making sure that ball gets depressed enough for it to go into its slot. So once it's in there, until it's pushed down against something, the ball's sticking out. So again, rotating it into place so that it can get into the frame at the same time, and taking it out just the reverse. Since we're here, we're going to go ahead and pop out that big spring so you can get a sense of what was holding all that fun stuff together. So looking at it in the frame, hopefully you can follow along here. That was that 90-degree upturn, comes along, makes a curve along the body, down here, and through the back of the magazine catch. Essentially, there's really nothing holding it in except the friction on two little pieces of the frame that it goes through. So the whole piece can be rotated once you get it out from under this little bit here in the frame. So if you just stick something under that, and keep in mind that it's a spring, that's what this looks like out of the gun. So laying it down here where it's doing all of its fun stuff, you can get a sense of how it was doing that. So I ejected my magazine safety, or magazine release at the same time there. So the magazine release does have its own spring system. It's another plunger and detent, but this one is significantly longer and shaped different than the other one, so it's pretty easy to keep an eye on. But the back of it here has this big groove, and that groove is what matches this groove here. And so when this piece is in place, now to take it off, we lifted it up and back, which let everything come out. But while it's in there, that groove is sitting here in the magazine, so the magazine safety can move a little bit left and right. The groove is quite wide, so that's enough to move it to do the function of releasing the magazine. And over here, that part that we've got going there, that's grabbing hold of the big rim in the pin. So that's sitting there. So again, one very oddly shaped piece of metal, really, because it's just following all the contours of the gun. It has this little tiny right angle at the end to stick through the frame as an anchor point, and that's what's holding the magazine in, or magazine safety, magazine release. Again, if you really want to take all this stuff apart to clean it, that's great. Just don't lose the tiny springs. And now we're down to the sear system. There is the sear spring in here still, so it's going to make the sear flop way over, but that's the sear itself, and it's pushing back towards the back of the gun under pressure of this tiny wound spring here. And if you notice, if you take a good look at that wound spring, what you'll see is that not only does it wind around that, but it's this is the other leg of it, the retention of the first pin we took out. So this is another multi-function spring, and while it's still in there under coil pressure, it's actually providing tension on the last pin in there just a little bit, and actually not much at all. I was able to just tap that past it, which is nice. So that's our sear pin, and I'm going to get that out of there to show you what's going on with that. So when it sits in here, there's a little the reason it's got this big loop down at the bottom is because there's a slot in the frame that rides in. So when we go to put this spring in, we'll be able to put it in without anything else in the gun and have it just sit there. The next thing it's doing here is riding in that groove. Pop it out past the groove so you can see it. There's a little tiny groove on the pin, and it sits in there, and that keeps the sear pin from drifting. And what puts the rest of the tension on it here, so the short leg is pushing on the sear. It's going to want the sear to move towards, rotate towards the back of the gun, and what gives it pressure is something has to push on this leg of the spring a little bit to get some tension. And what that something was way back to the first thing we took out, the hammer pin. So when the hammer pin is in here, they look in the gun like they're right on top of each other, but in fact the spring crisscrosses. So the spring, if I got enough fingers to demonstrate this, the spring is on the back side of the hammer, and that when they're in the gun, one right on top of the other, that's putting all this tension on this leg. So it's when you put the hammer pin in and bend this leg out, far enough over to put it in there, it's providing the retention on the pin and all of the pressure on the sear. So try not to bend this piece when you take it in and out, or you'll get all monkeyed up. Now the sear's got some funky cutout shapes on it for all manner of reasons, and we'll get into the details of how it goes. But let's talk about how it actually works as a sear. Essentially like this. So there's a pressure pushing it towards the back of the gun. The hammer strut wants that hammer to push straight up, but it can't rotate because that little cutout in the hammer, the sear's in the way. So in order for this to go bang, something has to grab the sear and pull it forward. Something rotates the sear forward, then the hammer can slam, and then as it's being cocked, it's going to come around again, and the sear is going to pop back into that crevice as soon as it can. So for all of its crazy shape, what you're looking for is that curved surface on the back is a good indicator that that's where it's going to find its match on the hammer. So not like this, just like this. And if we look at the other bits, we can work through how the trigger ends up actually pulling on the sear to make it go. And we've got to put some of it together to show us that in action. Running into the problem of not enough arms to demonstrate this properly. Yeah, we might be able to pull that off. To use actually that spring might keep us from falling on all the parts on the inside. So that's how everything sits in the gun. And what you'll see, I'm not sure why I put the magazine safety on there, probably just to keep it oriented, but really it's not part of the equation. The trigger is going to sit in there right lined up with the sear itself and push it like that, and now there's room for the sear or for the trigger bar to get pushed downward, which means the sear can come back over it, and when the trigger is released and comes back upwards again, then it can get behind that sear one more time to pull it forward. So that's what's going on the side here. Is when the trigger is in the vertical position, it's going to bump into the sear here and rotate it forward. The disconnect stroke simply pushes it into this gap in the bottom of the sear, which lets the sear pop forward to engage the hammer again. And then you let off the trigger and it's going to spring back behind it again. You pull the trigger, leans it forward, disconnect stroke pushes it down, sear comes back, catches the hammer, release the trigger, trigger return, pops it up. So that's the whole cycle. Pulling the trigger, popping it off, disconnect. That's why it works, why it goes bang. And I did say that it's smart to keep these systems separate, so like the rocket scientist I am going to actually listen to my own advice. And you're out of parts. There's nothing left. Because that's all a gun is. Trigger, sear, hammer, and enough stuff to make it all go together. So putting it back together is kind of important to do in order so you don't drive yourself insane. As I mentioned, there is a tiny ridge. A little hole in there. Hopefully you can see that hole. I'm gonna stick the old knife down into the hole. So that's what we're talking about. This hole right here. It's immediately below the sear pin, so hopefully not too hard to find. That's where our sear spring goes. And so if you've got nimble enough fingers, then you can just drop it in there. If you're like me, you're going to need to use a pair of pliers just to hold on to it. Now it looks like I've also mangled my spring a little bit, so recommend don't do that. And also, if you do it, buy another one. Just bending these back into place, not necessarily the healthiest way to keep your gun functioning. Alright, so that's going to sit in there, and then we want to get the sear pin going through there, and the sear itself. Now, again, in order to do this, a pair of pliers to hold the sear, and then You want to start the pin in just through the body of the frame, and then lower the sear to where it needs to be to catch it. And then as you're coming all the way through, now remember that the groove on the pin is got to be on the left where that spring is going to engage with it. And when you come around to this side, you get a peek in there and line it up. I'm off center a bit, so get my my spring back in its little slot. That's actually what happened, is my spring popped out of the hidey hole when I turned the gun. So as we guide that sear through, it helps to take a punch from the other side to make sure that you are catching that sear spring fairly well centered. And again, just you're gonna pass through that spring, which is the tensioning mechanism, moving the whole bench around. And when you do that, as you go past it, you're going to click into that spring. Now remember, it's not tons of force that it's got to hold that in place, but it will keep it from drifting around too much just as soon as it's in there. And of course, the sear is going to flop around. The important part is that if you push the sear forward, this spring here should be kicking it backwards. So make sure you have it on the right side of that spring, the rear side, so that it's pushing back. Because remember, the hammer is going to be behind it, and sear needs to push on the hammer. So that was our sear system, and that was all well and good. The next bit we put in, however, was the magazine, say a magazine release, and the big gigantic crazy spring that holds it all in place. So since that just slides in from the back, you line up. It's a big half moon shape, so it's not really hard to find. And what you got to do is put some tension on it while you put this spring in. So you're gonna guide this spring in and find the itty bitty hole. So just like that, and then paying careful attention, you're going to lean it forward, and it's going to grab the magazine safety or magazine release, but you need to hang on to it long enough to get it tucked in at the top. So when it's in place, it's going to snap in just barely under this ledge here, and that's what holds the whole thing in. Now eventually there'll be the trigger pin locking it in, but really it's just a little bit of friction right here that holds that piece in, and if it does pop forward, there's enough spring here to send it flying. So hang on to it. The next part is the slide stop, and again, if you lower it into the body and then get past the detent in the frame and rotate it up into place, getting that leg into the frame. I think I missed. I didn't get my detent pushed. Take that out so I don't mangle my spring. Sit it in there. There we go. I mean, these parts are generally going to stay in with friction on their own, but don't shake it while you're doing that, or you'll have a bad time. If you recall that this guy is just going to sit in here, and we do want to have the trigger bar in place because there's not room to get it in afterwards. So you're going to lower the trigger in and just leave the trigger bar flopping around up top. But you do want to pay attention to the hole in the trigger, because you want to line it up. You're going to put the trigger pin in, remembering that in this case the big groove is over on the right side of the frame, and in order to get it started in, you've got to match it through both the slide lock lever and the body of the trigger, and as you're coming through, it's going to hit a point where it's going to stop, and that's because our spring is in the way. And so just like the process for disassembly, you just push down on that little 90-degree part of the spring to get the pin past it, and then the pin will slide in and you'll hear it click into place. And if you forgot to put your trigger bar on, you're going to have to take it back out because it's not in a position where it has enough room to move left or right yet. Now, here's where it can get a little bit ugly. The trigger return spring / disconnector spring, trigger bar spring, the whole thing just sits there, and once we start putting things together, if we're not paying attention and the trigger bar flops too far forward, it's not holding it in anymore. So when it's back, it's holding it in, and that spring and detent can't come out. But just keep it in mind that it's not being held in there overly solidly yet. So now we're going to assemble the parts leading up to the hammer here again. So we have our cylinder with the rim on it, and that's going to sit in the back here of the trigger bar. But let's get our whole stack on this cylinder at once so that we can put it in as a unit. So the first is the magazine release, and again it's going to have the same orientation as the safety, and that's what goes over the edge of the sear. The crazy spring mechanism, and again, if you're wondering how that goes on, just pay attention to the back of the magazine safety, or the right side of it, and it's got that curved cutout here that the spring just barely hooks over. And so that's going to go in. The hammer itself, of course, if you do this and you bump the parts around, just make sure you get the spring back where it's supposed to be at the end of the day. And all of that is going to sit in that. Remember that the back end of that cylinder sits inside the trigger bar. And that means when you put this together, you kind of have to have all that going in at once for it to work. And the other fun part is, of course, this is going to want to get in the way at the same time as well. So there's a little bit of a trick. I say a little bit because its effectiveness is often relative. And that is, we're going to put the safety in, and we're going to try and convince the safety to engage the sear. And so again, remembering that you want to get this into position and then under some pressure so the detent gets pushed in and holds itself. What we're also going to do at the same time is flip the sear up, and we're going to actually put this on in such a way that it engages that sear. So we get it into the hole in the frame, and we're going to move the sear into position so that the safety is actually catching it. And on top of all of that, we're going to start the hammer pin. And remember that this little spring needs to get onto the back side of the hammer pin. So we're going to pull it back just a bit. The idea here is to get not that. Yes, I've managed to launch all of my little parts. I said be careful not to launch. There it is, the detent spring. So we're going to try that again. The whole point of this is to try and make it easier on ourselves. So let's see what we can think through in advance to help us out. Maybe if we get that hammer pin started beforehand and on the right side of it, that'll make it a little bit easier to guide its way on. Get the sear kind of moving towards the front to begin with. Lower this into the frame. Get it on the right side of everything. Pin back. that's what we're shooting for. So we've got the hammer pin started, we've got it going through the safety, and we've got the safety holding the sear in the forward position, and the spring that's eventually going to sit on the back of this notch in the hammer pin is on the correct side of it, providing a little bit more tension for the whole thing. Just made that flush so we have room to manipulate everything else, and in theory that's going to make it easier for us to put the rest of the guts back in all at once. So since I dropped this out earlier by accident, as I kind of predicted I would, I'll come back in here now and drop it into the trigger. The trigger is going to hold all that in place. Take this whole mechanism, again getting it all lined up the way it needs to be, and set into the holding the trigger bar. And now we can kind of hold this whole thing as a unit. And the hardest bit here is this spring itself. We're going to let it drop pretty far in, because where we're going is that spring has to end up back here on the back of the frame, where that's where we're aiming for. The spring can't be in front of the sear system. Now the hammer tail is going to be in that same orientation as well, so that's what we're shooting for as we put it in there, is to make sure that spring clears its way towards the back, and that whole kit and caboodle goes in, and we just gotta look through the side and line it up with the hammer pin, and the hammer pin's going to line up with the cylinder, and there we go. It goes all the way through. Now that last click you heard is because I remembered that we had put the safety on, which means the only way we were going to get it in there is if the hammer was in the cocked position. I was kind of pushing against the safety that I had set on to hold the parts together, so apologize for that. If you have the hammer all the way back, that'll make getting it in easier. And I'm not locked in yet. I still got to just line it up with this side. But once I do that, I hear my pin clip into the hole over there, and now I've got enough tension that that's not going anywhere, and I've tightened up the sear pin tension. And just to double check on the magazine safety, we can look in through the back, and we should see a couple things going on. One is the tail of the hammer should be free to flop around, so that's what's catching the tail. And if we look inside, we should see that the spring is in fact behind all the parts and leaning on it. And the other way we know that that's actually happened is by virtue of the fact that it's under tension. So when we lift the magazine safety up, which we can also illustrate by, go figure, putting in a magazine, it's actually the back of the magazine that comes up and pushes that up. We see that it actually works. So the magazine pushes that out of the way, and that's how it knows it's got a magazine in, and all our bits are working. In the fire position, now, with the safety on, if I try and pull the trigger, there's two things stopping the thing from working. One is the magazine safety that was holding the sear in, so now that's out of the way, but I still can't do anything because the actual safety on the other side holding the spring in. I disengage that, now there's nothing on the left side of the sear, nothing on the right side of the sear, so when I pull the trigger now, the sear can actually move all the way out of the way and the hammer come forward. And of course, if either of these isn't true, the gun doesn't fire. So when the magazine comes out, that is essentially engaging the safety on the other side of the sear. So now, even though the safety is off, that hammer can't come forward because the magazine safety is still in the way. If I manually lift the magazine safety out, now I can get the sear forward and the gun can fire, defeating the safety. So that's important to know how and why your safeties work. It also is going to explain some of the complexity in getting the gun all the way back together that we're going to hit in just a couple minutes. So let's put the slide back together. So many parts. It's not that bad. What order do we put it together in? I think we take the extractor out last. Yeah. All right. So the extractor plunger, the longer of the springs, the smaller spring is actually the firing pin spring there, and the extractor. This system's going to go in. It doesn't have any pin to hold it in. Again, the plunger comes over the back of the extractor to hold it in, which means getting it in is simply a matter of getting the extractor into the hole, and then keeping it from rotating while we're pushing it all the way in. And we're going to push it in with the actual extractor so that the extractor will pop into place. So that just guides in from the front. And again, you kind of want to keep the orientation as close to straight up and down as possible, because what's going to happen here is it's going to want to turn like that. And so again, straightening it out. And if I could stop being Mr. Fumble Thumbs here, as you push this in, it's just going to pop into place. Now, considering what a nightmare it was to get out, that's kind of frustrating, but it really is that easy to get it back together. You're just pushing the whole thing straight back and it'll pop into place, because most of the forces are keeping it in the gun, which is kind of why taking it out was such a pain. So our firing pin mechanism here was, again, the little firing pin plunger alignment doohickey. Of course, this is a pretty fragile piece, so be careful with it. And also, this spring, if you damage it, replace it. There's no real good way to make an alternative spring for this. The right tension is hard to do. It looks like a lot of other springs, but it really is kind of a one-of-a-kind animal. I've seen a lot of guns come into the shop where someone tried to cut down a spring from an AR-15, a detent spring, some other clever but ill-advised repair job. Like an idiot, I managed to get most of these parts magnetized. That adds an element of challenge. So like I said, when putting it together, it's going to lie in the little hole that was drilled through the extractor side, and you have to get the firing pin started in the channel, flip the spring forward in such a fashion that we can get the firing pin engaged underneath it, and then the firing pin will drop down into that channel with the spring, and under slight compression we'll be able to get the firing pin, or the the retaining pin, all the way through it. There's no handiness or anything. The retaining pin sometimes is really loose. It's that spring is the only thing holding things together there. So that's the bolt, with the exception of the recoil system. So to get the recoil system in, again, start the front in, and the back is just going to compress the spring a tiniest little bit, and then it'll pop down. And you really just want it to be centered. It's going to get bumped around when we put the big pin in later. It's going to bounce around a little bit, but as long as it's roughly centered, you're not going to get in the way of that piece. The other part of the slide is the loaded chamber indicator. And again, paying close attention to the orientation of this stuff. This metal piece that sits inside the cutout of the plastic piece needs to have its tail under that spring, and it's pretty easy to do. That's not a huge challenge. Once you slide this in, make sure that the larger spring is on the little tiny plastic detent there. And so once that's all in place, you're going to get it started into the gun. And really, it's pretty easy after that, because once it's started, the pieces can't move left and right to get problematically in the way. And so, you know, you just work that blind pin in. It's going to go in nearly flush and just sit there, and it's magnetized, so it's not coming. Excuse me, not magnetized. I said that wrong. It's just not coming out because it has nowhere to go out. Once we put it on the frame, it can only drop down so far. So it's not magnetized. You use a magnet to take it out because it makes it easier, but I feel like there should be more parts, but there's really not. So we're back to the field strip position, and now all we got to do is get it back together. We are going to need a magazine for this, and again, remember to make sure you've picked up an empty magazine. Last thing you want to do is accidentally load it while you're trying to put it together. So the first part is just getting the frame and the slide back together. So if you recall, this little square hole and this little square lug are all that's going on. And so you put them together, and then you just slide, again, the slide backwards and the frame forwards for reassembly. And I'm going to, again, use the handy-dandy rubber/plastic mallet to tap that in. And really, model to model, it's hard to, it's not overly consistent. I've never at least seen a universal it's on far enough point. One of the ways that you can tell is by looking through the hole that we're going to have to get this pin through, and making sure that it's lined up all the way. If that hole is out of alignment, and you can see that the frame is noticeably, you know, not lined up, then you're not lined up yet. The other thing is you're going to get it on with about a 1/16 of an inch clearance there, and at the very front over here, it's going to be nearly flush at its most forward point. So again, though, it's easiest to remember that putting it together, you're kind of squeezing your parts, and taking it apart, you're pulling them. So to take it apart, slide forward, frame back. Put it together, slide back, frame forward. Squeeze it together, pull it apart. My sight coming loose? All right, not a problem. Now, since you may have bumped things around while you were doing this, what you want to do is make sure that the hammer is in the down position. So if you've been monkeying with it and you've managed to essentially get it in a quasi-fired state, hopefully you can see down in there that the back of the hammer is actually up. Just reach in with a finger and push the hammer down to make sure that it's out of the way and the bolt's going to have clearance. The other thing is to make sure you can find the hammer strut. If it's stuck in the frame and you can't easily get at it, that's going to create a problem later. So again, a finger in, and we're just gliding our finger along the underside to make sure that hammer is laying flat in the all the way cocked position, and that lets us slide the bolt in. As you're sliding the bolt in, if it gets wedged, it's because you've got it rotated at a funny angle. It should go in without resistance. And now we're at one of the early crucial stages of assembly. What's most important here is that we're going to be pushing this, it's going to go into the frame so that we can get it in there, and then we're going to be pushing it straight up. And the worst thing that can happen to us while we're doing this is if the hammer strut flips to the back and gets caught in here. So remember, we wanted to see the hammer strut to make sure it wasn't wedged back here, stuck on the frame. But we also don't want it to flop far enough forward to get caught here while we're pushing this in. So we really need the hammer strut to be far enough back that it's not going to get caught in this big claw, but not so far back that it gets knocked onto the inside of the frame. So this is when you're reading the instructions where it starts talking about point the gun up, point the gun down. All of what you're doing in those pointed here and there stages is really making sure that the hammer strut is falling in the right direction. So if it says point the gun up, you want the hammer strut to fall to the back. If it says point the gun down, you want the hammer strut to fall against the inside of the frame. So again, we're just going to pay attention to where the hammer strut is. At this point, it's visible leaning against the back of the frame. It's not stuck inside the frame. So we're going to be able to come in here and get our pin in there, get it started, and lift this straight up. It's going to get a little tight when it gets towards the top. And again, same as before, you want to grip it and pop it straight up. And the other thing you want to do in this position is check. You've popped it up, so the pin should be protruding out the top. That's holding the bolt in. And what you want to check out is that you can still see the hammer strut. And in fact, at this point, this is one of those stages where you would point it up for the next step. What we really want to see is just that hammer strut is visible there. Sorry, as I poke my head around. Because the next thing that we want to have happen is we want to get that hammer strut into the hammer spring. So if it's pinned somewhere, that ain't going to happen. I also let this flip shut. Remember that you're going to need this in the unlocked position as you go to put it together. Now, optimally, the hammer strut is now leaning towards the back, where when we rotate this closed, it's going to go right in there. But if you notice, when you go to do that, it's not rotating. And the reason is because the hammer is actually cocked and it's in our way. So in order for us to do this next step, we need the hammer to rotate forward out of our way. And the only way to do that is to discharge the trigger. But remember, you've got two safeties you're fighting against. So this safety has to be off, and the magazine safety has to be off. So this is one of those points where you have to have a magazine in the gun far enough to disengage that other safety. That's all I change. So if I take the magazine out and I try and rotate this back, it's going to stop right there. It's just not going to go very far. Be careful not to overdo it and start to lever it back out. Make sure it's pushed all the way up. But once the magazine is in there, that's enough to engage the magazine safety. And no, I can pull the trigger at that point, and now I can rotate. So with the magazine in and the trigger pulled, because we got both safeties off, now we're able to push we're using this piece to push the hammer out of the way. Again, remember that we want to catch that hammer strut. So make sure this is that kind of pointed up phase. All you're really doing is making sure the hammer strut is towards the back, so that as we close this, the hammer strut is now actually aligned and in this chamber. The last step is to simply close this, but you can't do that if the magazine's in there. The magazine is now going to get in our way, so we take the magazine out, and then we can snap it closed. Now, the first thing you want to do is check to see, did I do all of this right? And the answer is, you can get it this far, but you might not have noticed that some particular step was too hard or too easy. Usually too hard is the big danger sign. So what you want to do is give it the old-fashioned test and gently cock it. You should be able to cock it, and it should come all the way back forward. And if you put your magazine in and pull the trigger, you should hear the hammer drop. So again, it's under heavy spring tension. Once it gets the spring cocked, it's much more consistent. Pull the trigger, test the disconnect stroke as well by racking it a second time, and we should be able to hear the disconnect as we come off the trigger. And then pull the trigger again, hammer drops. So our function check is good, and our gun's in one piece. That's pretty promising. One of the things you may have noticed as I was doing this was that I talked about the slide lock, and if I manually use it, it works great. But on the last round, it's not locking back. And you might think it's broken. Well, not really. Not everybody likes their magazines to work that way, for reasons that I don't really comprehend. But Ruger designed their magazines so you didn't have to lock back on the last round. Apparently, when it was new and shiny, there were people in the world who didn't want their firearm to automatically lock back on the last round. So the way they did that is kind of clever. The thumb piece, so when you're you're loading, I'm going to pull this out just so we can talk about it. When you're loading 22 magazines, they will always have a thumb piece. They will always have something that comes through the side of the magazine, because if you're loading 22 rounds like you're loading 9mm, by pushing them in and pushing them back, you're mangling your magazine. 22 magazines are fragile, and they are oriented at a very, very difficult to achieve pair of angles. There is a different amount of space and angle to the rear feed lips as there are to the front feed lips. There's always a cut between them. This is designed so that the round is coming out in two different ways at two different times, which means when you load it, if you're pushing down against this stuff, you're making a mess. So you pull down with your thumb. The thumb relieves the pressure and brings the other rounds down, or the feeder, or the feeder. Good Lord. I've totally spaced on the follower. There we go. The follower in the magazine, you're bringing that down manually with your thumb against the spring pressure, and you will drop the round in. And the back of the round will be dropped in right in the center, and the front up here, and it will drop in and it will fall back on its own. You will not have to push that round in with any force at all. If you're pushing rounds into a 22 magazine, you're just shortening the lifespan of the magazine and making a mess. And they're a pain in the butt to get corrected, because the angles have to be perfect for them to work right. They basically have just the right amount of tension to barely hold on to a round as it's being feeded at various points. That's why you don't see tons of other rimmed rounds with magazines. They don't really work well in the whole magazine, and I don't know of anybody who's ever figured out a way to double stack rimmed rounds. But the point is, though, there's going to be a thumb piece for moving the follower manually down. And what Ruger did is they decided to make that also have a dual function, like just about every other darn piece in the gun. And if you pop the thumb piece out, you can take the follower out to clean it, but the point is, it can go in from either side. If it's on the left side of the gun, or of the magazine, push it all the way in, and then it only goes in and out at the bottom where the wide circle is. Other than that, it's riding the rails. On the left side of the gun, it's what operates the lockback mechanism. So when this is installed on the right side of the gun, then there's nothing at all happening on the left side. So that last round feeds, and there's nothing going on here that would make a difference. But when I reverse it and put it in on the left side of the magazine, it's what actually is going to bump up the tail here of the what am I trying to say? Slide lock. Sorry, I was playing with it. So the slide lock is sitting in there, and it comes back just far enough to hit here, and it's actually that lifts it up. So if I put this back together with that make sure that I get this spring. The spring actually screws onto the back of the follower. Not a lot, it just threads on one coil essentially, so make sure that it's firmly mounted. Then the actual follower itself, and then there's this big lump at the end, which is what's going to hold it all in there. So as you pack this spring in, try not to kink it up too much. It does get kind of challenging towards the end. Until you can get it started in the body. And then the shoe goes on from the front to the back, and that big metal piece of the back pops in, holds it all in place. So the whole point of that was to show you that now, with that in there, when I go to rack it, it stays back. And what's holding it back is, if you peek through here, and you look, that's the button. That's the that's the button that we use to pull it down to load rounds, that we can see in the window lifting that up. So the spring force that's actually pushing up on this is purely the magazine spring. So that's it. When there's rounds in there, they're holding the follower down. But when there's no more rounds, the follower and the thumb piece are free to pull up the rest of the way. So again, sitting in there, that's the piece that you see lifting the slide lock up. So while you might be tempted to see this opening in the side and think, like most magazines, that there's an opening that is engaging something, or that some part of the follower becomes visible or invisible, it don't work that way. It's actually this piece. So if for some reason you want a gun that doesn't lock back, just reverse the thumb loader side to the right side of a magazine, and you're good to go. I think I actually keep one in each orientation. Came with 2 magazines. Yeah, I actually had that one deliberately set like that, so that I would have one that would lock back on the last round and one that wouldn't. So now I've messed it up, but that's okay. So I'm going to set this one back to non-lockback mode. Put it all back together. Prove to you that I'm not lying. And by comparison, the other magazine that has it on the left side, so this one, it's on the right side, that's on the left side, locks back. Right side, no lock back, unless we manually do it. So that's the Ruger Mark III 1022. If you've got a Mark II, it's essentially the same gun. Somewhere in there, the magazine safety came into being. I don't remember if it's between the 1 and the 2 or the 2 and the 3. The 2 also had, instead of the magazine release being up there, the 2 had it on the bottom, which is kind of bizarre if you think about it, because the reason it's called the 2245, I think I might have said 1022 a minute ago. The reason it's called the 2245 was that the slide lock and the trigger and the grip angle are all the same as on a 1911, and the thumb safety. So they're not shaped like the 1911s in any imaginable way, but from a usage standpoint, if the 1911, if you were used to firing that and it fit in your hand, all the controls of this are going to be in the same place. It's going to have a light trigger. Yeah, it's still a rotating trigger as opposed to the trigger bar of the the straight back pull of the 1911, but it's a target pistol, so it's a really light trigger pull to begin with. And then the thumb safety is in the same place as where it would be on a 1911, where your thumb is, and the slide lock, again, in the same position. So if you overlaid a 1911 here, you'd find that these controls and the grip angle all line up. Now, the obvious missing part in the Mark 1 and 2 was the magazine release, because it was still down at the bottom, an old style hook your thumb around it from the back. So with the Mark 3, they got the magazine release in the right spot, leaving you with a gun that control-wise, everything is geographically located in the same place it would be on the .45 caliber 1911. I don't really know why else besides that, what they were really thinking of, because frankly, it's a phenomenal target pistol. Before this, you had the Browning Buckmark, and the Colt Woodsman even before that, as you were getting this concept of target rifles that had big substantial barrels in a .22 caliber gun. And if you think about the mechanics of that completely offsets recoil, because recoil is how much the entire gun is going to get accelerated backwards by the bullet going forwards. And the more mass that your gun has, the less, the total momentum force is going to be the same, but that mass takes a lot longer and will accelerate to a much lower speed. So the felt recoil on a big heavy gun is
just nothing by comparison to the light one. Even in this, if you get the kind of the Assassin's model, that one with the hollow barrel shroud, the 2245 light, that thing weighs nothing, and as a result, it doesn't kick like a 9mm, but between shots, you get a lot more motion. With this thing, pop, 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 it just doesn't move. It's a great target pistol. So, anyway, that's it for today at the bench. Hope you had fun.